Greetings and bienvenue, Midnight Crew. Thank you for returning to this broadcast, and welcome to new viewers joining us for the first time. If you like a video, then feel free to subscribe.
A few of my relatives were raised in the North Carolina mountains. There were a lot of stories that came out of the region, but the one tale that each one of us knew the best was that of the demon dog of Val Crucis. The community of Val Crucis, which is Latin for Vale of the Cross and refers to the valley where three streams come together to form a shape similar to a cross, is rustic and a favorite destination for tourists. But don't let the quaint scenery hide the truth. There is a dark side to Val Crucis. There's an old stone church, St. John's Episcopal, located along Highway 194 just on the edge of town, where in the churchyard cemetery the supernatural moves among the venerable graves. St. John's was built in the 1860s, and the legends of the Hellhound and other strange beings have been told for several generations. The traditional story starts on a clear moonlit autumn night. Two young men, who were students at a local college, were driving through the Val Crucis area when they received the shock of their lives. They were driving along Highway 195 that leads through Val Crucis at around midnight. As their car passed the old church, the young men saw a large shadow leap out from behind one of the tombstones in the church graveyard. The shadow leaped into the road in front of them. The driver swerved his car to avoid the shape that suddenly landed in his path. He slammed his foot on the brake and pulled his car over to the shoulder of the road, according to the witnesses' accounts. Both he and his friend were startled to see that it was a massive dog. It was as tall and big as a fully grown man. The fearsome canine was covered with bristling black fur and had large yellow teeth. And most unusual of all, the dog's eyes were glowing. They were not reflecting back the light like a dog's or cat's eyes will sometimes do. Instead, these eyes were really glowing with a weird red light. One of the young men turned to the other and asked, "Do you see that?" His friend said no, and neither do you. As the unearthly growling beast walked toward their car, the driver took his foot off the brake and hit the gas. The car roared down the winding mountain road and barely made it along the sharp curves. The driver did his best to control the car as the speedometer reached 60 and then 70 miles an hour. The driver looked in his rear view mirror and his face turned white from what he saw. The ghostly dog was keeping up with his speeding car. It was even gaining on them. Determined to get away from the nightmarish canine, the driver pushed his accelerator even harder. His car leaped over a bridge just below where the streams meet to form a cross. At that point, the dog stopped following them and vanished from sight. The two frightened young men drove into Boone and stopped at the local diner because it was the only place open at that hour. They knew they would not get any sleep that night. They also knew they would never forget the demon dog of Val Crucis. Traditionally, the tales from this area center around a supernatural canine, but there have been other odd sightings, including the apparition of a woman near the very same cemetery. There have also been sounds of gunshots and of a female crying. No one has attributed these sounds to any known event, but it's just another unexplained occurrence typically encountered at the location.
Some years ago, in 2015, I was talking to an old school friend's mother. They were farmers in the town of Kirkham, Lancashire. She told me a story of the time she saw a strange animal at the bottom of one of her fields. In the summertime, every evening, she would walk the fields with her black Labrador. At the time, her son had put out a couple of garden chairs under a tree for her to sit on. These were placed in the last field she used to walk in. The dog would sniff and run around as they do. She would sit and enjoy the evening sunshine. One evening, she had her usual walk with her dog. She got to the last field and sat down for a rest and enjoyed the view. Then at the very bottom of the field, which backs onto the railway lines, she saw a large animal. I asked her what it looked like. She described seeing a large dark brown or black animal about the size of a bull, but it looked more like a dog. It was walking on all fours from right to left, keeping very close to the fence which separated her land and the railway cutting. She is not sure if it was on her side of the fence or the railway side. I asked her if it was a wild boar or a deer or just a large dog. The answer was a definite no. This lady had been around animals and farmyard stock all her life, and I am pretty sure she knew what she saw, and it was none of the animals I mentioned.
A couple of years ago, I was driving my girlfriend of the time home late one night. We stopped at an intersection near her neighborhood where I decided to look down to change the song playing on my phone. When I looked back up, I saw a large black dog run right in front of my headlights. My girlfriend said,
"Whoa, did you see that?"
"Yeah, it was just a dog."
"No, that dog looks weird."
right there, and then it passed in front of my lights again. I was terrified when I noticed it had no features but more like a solid black mass in the shape of a dog. It ran past my window and I noticed it had what seemed like smoke coming off of it. What the F is that? I screamed. It circled around and went past my girlfriend's window, going directly into my car's beam of lights again. As soon as it cleared them, I floored it and sped off down the street. We both couldn't believe what we had seen. When we got to her house, we sat in the car and tried to process what had happened. She broke down in tears and revealed to me that an uncle of hers had seen the dog we had just seen shortly before he passed. She said what we had seen was exactly what he had described to her family. He said he felt it was death coming after him. I comforted her as she cried and tried to play tough, but deep down I was absolutely terrified. Was it there for her or for me? A couple weeks later, I was driving alone one night down a dark country road that I would usually cruise on the weekend. Everything was normal when I noticed something moving just out of the beams of the light of the car on the edge of the road as I drove. I slowed down and was shocked to see what was revealed by my headlights. It was that dog again, but this time it was running alongside my car as I drove. I was terrified when I suddenly remembered that the speed limit for this road was 70 miles per hour. This thing was keeping up with me. It was exactly like I had seen it before. A large black mass with smoke coming off of it. As I glanced back and forth between the road and it, I slammed on the brakes. When I turned to look at it, its head was backwards, not turned, and it was looking right at me with glowing white eyes. I'd never been more afraid in my whole life. I immediately did a U-turn and hauled ass back into town. I was shaking the entire way home. Was what I saw a hellhound or something else? Are these things associated with death? My grandfather passed shortly after these events. I've spotted the dog a couple of times since then while driving, but only for a brief moment as I passed it.
I'm from the UK and I was wondering if you had any idea what this might have been. I was young at the time, about 11 years old, and was taking a walk in the woods with a good friend of mine who I still know to this day. At the time I lived in a small village in the south of England. My friend lived in the village next to mine and I was over at her place for the day. She lived in an old-style Victorian house which was separated from the rest of the village by a woodland area about 2 miles deep. They were and still are quite posh and pretty well off. There was a small country road that went round the side of the woodlands and connected their house and the village, but when walking we always cut through the woods as it was so much faster. Right at the edge of the woods, before the rest of the village, was a livery yard where there were lots of horses. We used to go and sneak apples too and pet, and that day we were on our way to do this. Once we reached around the halfway point through the woods, there was a small clearing in the trees. We stopped to use a rope swing on the edge of the clearing. My friend was pushing me on the road swing when we heard something in the woods howl. I remember distinctly the fact that it didn't sound like a regular dog howl. I've grown up in a family with lots of large dogs and it just didn't sound quite the same. It sounds silly, but it just didn't sound right. Normally I wouldn't really take much notice and pass it off as someone out walking a dog, but I looked at my friend and they looked nervous and frozen in place too. It was that sort of moment when your instincts are trying to figure out whether there's a real threat there or not. I don't really know how to describe it, but it just sounded too perfect, almost like it was a fake sound effect being played. We don't have wolves or anything similar in the UK, so it had to have been a pet dog, but it just howled once perfectly and then it stopped. There was nothing, no barking, no other howls, not even the sound of any movement in the woods. It was just dead silence. After a few seconds, without talking, we sort of both silently agreed to get a move on and not delay any further. We walked onwards without talking. A while later, with about 1/4 of the way left to go, my friend stopped suddenly in front of me and pointed at the trees in the distance in front of us. I looked and could see in the distance something that looked like a wolf, but so much bigger, standing and staring right at us. It was a little ways away, so I don't exactly have any specifics, but it was at least as tall as my 11-year-old self. Each paw was planted firmly on the ground, a dark brown shaggy body positioned directly at us. Its ears were up, and I remember vividly it had yellow, amber eyes. I know domestic dogs can have light brown eyes that can kind of look orangey, but I've never seen one with yellow eyes, which is something that always has stuck with me. We were sort of stuck there for a while looking at it until it eventually backed off into the woods. I remember if I didn't turn around and walk away, it walked slowly backwards, in a sort of unnatural, uncomfortable way until it was out of view. It just struck me as odd. We obviously weren't a threat to it, it was massive. It also had decided it didn't really want anything to do with us as it wasn't coming after us. Normally if a dog isn't interested in a toy it would just turn around and walk away, but it just backed off unnaturally like it didn't know what it should be doing. After that we ran back in the direction we'd come from all the way back to her house. We were much closer to the village, but at that point there was no way we were going the direction the wolf thing disappeared to. It could have been a normal dog, but the thing is it was massive, had bright yellow eyes, and no owner in sight. Even if it was a massive stray dog, these sort of things don't really go unnoticed, as unlike places like America with lots of wide open spaces. In England, you are never more than a couple of miles away from somewhere inhabited, and people are always walking through the countryside, so surely anything living should have been caught at some point or at least been made aware of. As well as this, things like wolves just simply don't live in the UK, so that couldn't be a possibility, even though it was much bigger than any normal dog.
Very curious. Reminds me of this story my strict, no-nonsense grandfather told, over and over to anyone who would listen, and swore to its truth, even as his mental state/memory deteriorated later in his life. Be my late grandfather, late 1950s. Born and raised in remote, very religious Greece, mountainous and secluded area. Walking back to his own village once late at night. Here's something trotting behind him. It's a little dog, almost puppy-sized. Grandfather thinks it's strange, hadn't encountered any dogs of that kind, especially alone in such a remote area. Doesn't think much of it, keeps walking. Continues to hear trotting. Turns around again. This time, he swears the dog was a little larger than before, but he dismisses it as his imagination. He is slightly spooked, but the dog still seems harmless, if not a little strange in following him. Trotting seems to get louder. Grandfather turns around once more. There is no disputing it this time, the dog was definitely larger, considerably so, growling quietly. Now he's definitely frightened, and every time he looks over his shoulder, the dog is getting larger and seems to have evolved into some kind of hellhound or demon. He's running now for his life from this demonic hound, convinced entirely he had somehow attracted some demon or other. Along the lonely road he passes by a chapel and busts inside, slamming the door shut and encasing himself in darkness. He leans against the door, panting in terror. As he does so, he swears to this day he heard a cold voice on the other side of the door that chills him to this day. "You're lucky you were protected tonight." Grandfather believes the demon was referring to the piece of an Orthodox saint's fabric that he died in, I think. Otherwise something similarly blessed, he kept on him for protection. The saint had a connection to my grandfather's region.
I live in a nice suburb of Metro Detroit. There aren't many large animals in the area, aside from deer. The only other animals in the area are your typical pets, squirrels, and an occasional fox or two for the most part. It's a pretty tame area. I was driving through the neighborhood leaving my girlfriend around midnight last summer. As I was driving north on a street in the subdivision, something caught my eye from the very left edge of my field of view. It appeared to be a very large and well-built creature, hurtling from a backyard on the grass and into the street. I slammed on my brakes immediately in disbelief at what I was witnessing. It was moving extremely fast. I don't have a very good estimate, but I would say at least 40 to 50 miles per hour. The yard in which it emerged from was directly facing a short cul-de-sac that backed up to some trees and then more houses beyond that. I immediately turned right facing the court so that my headlights would illuminate the path it seemed to be running. I was only able to witness it for a few more seconds, but I have no doubt in my mind that whatever I witnessed was real. The creature was very large. If I had to compare the size to another animal, I'd say it was about the size of an adult lion. The body type appeared to be that of a dog, although I've never seen any breed of dog this size, and there are absolutely no wild, stray dogs in the area. It had a pitch black coat, and while I could slightly make out the shape of its head from the side, I never saw its eyes or mouth. When it ran past my headlights initially, it never acknowledged my presence. It did not turn and look at me, slow down, or do anything that was directed toward me. When I turned towards the court, I was only able to see the back of the creature before it disappeared into the backyard of the center house on the court and into the woods. Determined to get a better look, I drove recklessly over 40 miles per hour out of the court and around the bend to the street in which the yard would back up, but it was already gone. I continued to drive home and tell my girlfriend about what I had seen. With no explanation, I kind of shrugged it off as just being a very unusual night. Now, this is what I believe was my second encounter with what I'm guessing was a hellhound. I don't remember exactly how many days later it was, probably about a week, but I went to smoke a cigarette outside my house around midnight. I typically go out through my garage and smoke on the side of my house next to the garage. I put on my shoes and walked through my laundry room to the garage door. It's an attached garage. As I stepped into my garage, I had a very bad feeling overtake me. It's the type of feeling you get when you think you're being watched or stalked. The hairs on my neck and arms stood up and I felt a very eerie, sinking feeling in the bottom of my stomach. I paused, stood completely still, not breathing, to assess the situation. A few seconds passed and I heard and saw nothing. I looked over to my right to see that the side door was completely shut, but something still did not feel right. There are 2 vehicles that stay parked in my garage that are for summer driving only. I look around and still don't see or hear anything. Then, out of what seemed like nowhere, the furthest vehicle from me begins to shake. I immediately think, oh, it's just a cat, but then I realize that there's no way any house cat in my neighborhood could cause the vehicle to move like that. That's when it went from scary to absolutely frightening. As the car is shaking, I hear the most horrific sound I probably will ever hear in my entire life. It sounded like an extremely deep growl mixed with high, alternating pitches of screeching all at the same time. The noise hit me at the deepest, most primal level and struck a level of fear I've never experienced. Even when I've faced life or death situations, held up at gunpoint, I've never felt this feeling. It was deafeningly loud and the vehicle began to shake even more. The noise was more horrifying than anything Hollywood could dream up. It sounded like whatever it was warning me to leave, but then began to get angered at my presence. I was too afraid to stay any longer and immediately slammed the door into my house and locked both locks. I put a note on the door telling my brother to go out the front in the morning, as there's something in the garage and it's extremely agitated. I ended up calming down and going to sleep without really worrying about it. When I woke up, I saw my note and kind of laughed at myself for being so afraid. I went out through the front door and walked around to the side of my garage. The door was still shut. I sighed and decided that it was daylight. There was nothing to be afraid of. I opened the door away from me very quickly. Before I could blink, a pitch-black creature sprinted out of the door. This time, it was not as large as my initial encounter, but moved faster than any animal I've ever seen in person, sans the other encounter. It appeared to be the size of a medium-large-sized dog, about 75 pounds, but the speed in which it was moving is inconsistent with any dog. Again, it seemed to be moving over 40 to 50 miles per hour, allowing me only to see it for a few seconds before it was over 50 yards from me disappearing into the woods. Again with the second encounter, it never looked at me. I never got a glimpse of its face or its eyes. I never stopped to think that what I had seen might have been paranormal until today. When I searched the description, I was horrified to see it match that of a hellhound. It seems the mythology behind these creatures is a bit contradicting. Omen of death, nothing may occur, or possibly a protector, but now I'm worried I'll encounter it for a 3rd time. I always felt it was unusual that it never looked at me, but now I'm thankful that it seemed to consciously choose not to. Folklore says that if it looks you in the eyes 3 times, it's a guaranteed omen of death. So now here I am and I don't know what to think. I feel confident that if this was a hellhound, it was not looking for me, but I don't know that for sure.
I believe my husband and I saw a hellhound. We live in rural northern Idaho. And we both hunt. So we know everything about animals, even in pitch darkness. We don't have normal plumbing. We have to turn on an electric well every morning to fill it up. Our tank can last us 3 to 4 days, but we like it filled, just in case. There are other tanks like that scattered in the woods, just waiting for someone to buy the land and build a home. We were taking a walk and it got dark, so we went back home. However, on our way home we saw something, not human or animal, near the well. It was hunched over like it was eating. We walked carefully closer, about 20 feet from this thing, trying to figure out what it is. Too large for a stray dog or wolf and too small for a bear. But whatever it was, it looked at us with red eyes. I've never been more scared in my life. My husband is scared of nothing and he was scared too. We took off running. My God, we never ran so fast in our lives. It did chase for a while, then it just disappeared. We got to our house and it was just gone. We knew it was behind us when we left the woods, but we couldn't see it. We locked all the windows and doors that night. We talked to one of the town locals about the thing we saw. He showed us a picture of a hellhound. He told us stories about people meeting the hellhound in the same area, always near a well, roads, crossroads, or places of death. Seeing him once will bring us happiness, seeing him twice will bring us sorrow, and seeing him 3 times will bring us death. I don't know what we saw, but hellhound is the only explanation.
I actually had a strange demon dog encounter. My hellhound/demon dog/chupacabra/hyena sighting also occurred in broad daylight at very close range, as it was eating a large goose down in the creek bed, and I must have startled it since I came right up on it unexpectedly. I am a biologist and I have a background in several specialized biological fields, have conducted tons of field research, and have been in forests and swamps ever since learning how to walk. This thing was massive and canine but sort of had hints of feline or hyena-like traits as far as its overall morphology and structure. It also moved oddly for a dog. As I said, I was almost right on top of it by the time we saw each other, and I slowly backed away, and once I had enough distance between us, I promptly fled. This encounter was very short, so I didn't have a lot of time to study every feature of its body, and I always chalked it up to simply being a massive and extremely bizarre or deformed dog, but I can't really justify that line of thinking, as this creature was unlike any canine I have ever seen or that appears in the fossil record of North America. I live in Pennsylvania, and we're not exactly known for having exotic wildlife, and it's humbling to admit that I, as a biologist, have nothing but assumptions about what it could be. I couldn't even tell you what taxonomic family it belongs to. It was lanky for a dog and did have rather long hind legs. I wouldn't characterize it as wallaby or kangaroo-like. It seemed to have high shoulders and moved more like a big cat, more stealthily.
I hope that you enjoyed tonight's broadcast. If you enjoyed tonight's story, then please subscribe to the channel, as more green texts will appear daily. A new broadcast will appear when the clock strikes midnight Central Time.
Remember to check out the Odyssey page in the description for a second archive of the channel's videos.